Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Jamie Bartram. I'm the director of the Water Institute here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, although at least some in this room know me better from my former role in the World Health Organization, where I managed its water, sanitation and hygiene activities for around a decade. It's my privilege to welcome you here to this conference, Nexus 2014, Water, Food, Climate and Energy, the first conference on this subject here at UNC. I have to say to you that for me, coming to this university has been an incredibly positive experience. Personally, it's been a pleasure to work in such a collaborative environment, and to come to a university that has made a system-wide commitment to dealing with major 21st century challenges, including the challenge of water as its first ever pan-campus 3-year theme. I hope being here at this conference is as pleasurable and as rewarding for you as my first few years here have been at the university. It's been really refreshing and encouraging to see the number of people who are both already here and will be arriving and joining us in the next few days to look at issues surrounding the Nexus concept. We were especially pleased to see so many people planning to arrive here and arriving here after we had to reschedule the timing of the conference in order that we didn't clash with the Open Working Groups event in New York earlier this week. I'm also personally refreshed to see that Nexusites are as anarchic as the remainder of the academic community. Because when we realized how many people were attending, we decided we had to move into this room rather than the room that we were originally planning. And we said to the venue managers, could you rope off the back few rows so it doesn't feel too dilute? So the anarchists at the back that are in the back few rows, congratulations, you're keeping up a great tradition. It's part of my duty this evening to recognise and to give a thanks to the sponsors that have kindly made this event possible and contributed to success. A special thanks to our platinum sponsor, Wells Fargo, who you will hear from tomorrow evening at dinner. Also to our gold sponsors, GRM International and Futures Group, and WWF, again, both of whom we will hear further from. To our silver sponsors, BioVision, Millennium Institute, UNC's Institute for the Environment, and WSPA. Bronze sponsors, the Centre for Law, Environment, Adaptation and Resources at UNC's School of Law, the Global Research Institute at UNC, the Luke Hoffman Institute, Monsanto, USAID, and CEDA's Securing Water for Food and Powering Agriculture Grand Challenge for Development. That's got to be the longest title I'm going to say this evening. And of course, Water in Our World. That's UNC's pan-campus theme that is going on at present. To our media sponsor, CSR Wire. And thanks to the many other partners also who've assisted us in developing, planning, and now implementing this conference. Thank you all. You've played a great role in the success of this event. And can we just put our hands together for them, because they really have made this possible. Now, when I was talking about thanking everyone that made it here, I forgot to mention there's an ice storm that tried to get between you and us. Well done, you overcame the ice storm. We've had to make minor adaptations to fit with that. And so in your bags, you should have both of these things. And apparently it's my duty to explain them, which assumes that I understand them. If you're looking for the general schedule, what happens day to day, then look at this book, the thing with the cover on the colour. Sorry, the colour on the cover. If you want the details of individual titles and fine-tuning, look at this additional schedule, because that's where some of the adaptations were captured that we introduced as we were finalising the planning. So that will give you the detailed lists of side events, the precise verbal presentations, the precise posters, and so on. I don't get to say a lot about the substance of the Nexus discussion this evening, but as I'm here, I'd like to make two observations. One, watching how this discussion has gradually formed and coalesced in a relatively short period of time, it strikes me that the attractiveness, the logic of an integrated and intersectoral perspective is intrinsically appealing. It's intellectually challenging. It's something we can be naturally drawn to. And yet we live in a world in which we run our countries, our institutions, in silos, whether it's ministries or the departments and the schools in academic institutions. That's the way in which we organise our world, the way we organise our management of our world today. And so this Nexus thinking runs contrary in some ways to the way that we've become comfortable with operating as a human race. It seems to me that's a bigger challenge than just a policy one, and it's a bigger challenge than just a science one. And one of the things we are struggling with is to find the practical examples of why and how the way we operate using a Nexus perspective is better than the way we operate today without one or with less of one. Many of the formulas that we see in, for example, target setting have been negative formulas. Achieve X, but do it without doing Y. Is the way that we've framed some of this. And it seems to me that we need to try and identify where the added value is from the Nexus perspective and phrase our targeting much more directly on that added value so that the Nexus approach becomes a catalyst rather than an impediment. Writing targets around value. Second comment from my side is that I think we are fortunate here in being able to bring together both science and policy perspectives, and that it's in bringing together the science that underpins and gives meaning to the Nexus perspective with a policy which will turn it into practice and implementation through which we will actually make a difference. Now, it's my duty here to introduce this plenary session, and what we've organised is a group of 4 panellists, each of whom will give a presentation. They've given me their solemn word that they will keep to timelines. Panellists always do. And then we will reserve time so there's the opportunity for discussion and for questions for the floor. And it seems to me that amongst the questions we ought to bear in mind are issues associated with how the scientific community can continue to promote intersectorality in a world that's defined and arrayed in a deeply sectoral manner. How is it that the scientific community can articulate what is and is not a Nexus question? When is a Nexus approach valuable, or when is it surplus to requirements? And how can we ensure that the evidence that we are seeing contributes to making effective, efficient, and timely policy? And speaking for a moment as an academic, I would say, and not filling up academic journals. The lineup we have is a group of individuals that I feel privileged to be able to introduce to you. They include individuals whose work I've followed and am rather a fan of. I will introduce them all now in one go rather than individually, and then the presentations will follow one after the other. First, joining us via Skype from Paris, it will be Lidia Brito. She is the Director of Science Policy and Capacity Building for Natural Sciences at UNESCO. Lidia is also the co-director of the Planet Under Pressure Conference and is the former Mozambican Minister for Higher Education, Science and Technology. After Lidia has spoken, we will then move along the 3 other panel members we have up here on the stage. Joachim von Braun, Director of the Centre for Development Research at the University of Bonn. Before his time at Bonn, Joachim was the Director General of IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, based just a little bit north of here, but the wrong side of that snow line in snowy DC. Now, our next speaker I needed to check with before we walked in the room. Johan will be known to, I think, many of us here. But before we walked in here, I said, Johan, I've never managed to pronounce your name properly. How do I get it right? And he looked at me and he said, don't worry, nobody does. Now, that wasn't very encouraging. I'm assured by Johan that the correct pronunciation is something like Johan Kuylenstierna. Johan is the Executive Director of the Stockholm Environment Institute, and he'll be speaking from a very wide perspective of his knowledge of the UN world, having served with UN DESA in New York, WMO in Geneva, and FAO in Rome. That has to make you an incredibly resilient individual. And I would like to personally thank Johan and his team at SCI for playing a lead role in developing the first draft of the declaration text in the science section here at this conference. And last on the lineup here is Josh Tewksbury, the director of the Luke Hoffman Institute, which is a project of WWF. Josh and the Luke Hoffman Institute as a whole have led the development of the Academic and Practitioners Network, concept note for which is online on the conference website, and the first meeting of which will take place on Thursday. And I'm going to say to you that the details of which will be found in the additional convenings page in your conference bag. I think that's that one. Okay? Now, each of our speakers will follow one on the other. I won't come up and introduce each, and it's therefore my privilege to step down and hand across electronically to Lidia. I hope that's going to work. You're on, Lidia. Everyone can see you. Okay. You're huge in the room.
Okay. Good evening, good afternoon to you all. Lidia Brito here. Apologies for not being with you today in Chapel Hills. And James, thank you, but I couldn't hear you really well. So I do hope that you can hear me from Paris. Allow me, before I start, also to thank the organizers for making sure that I was with you today, even if through Skype, and also to Kyle and the technical team that made it possible to try to connect us across oceans, across continents. The topic today is past, present, and future. But I thought that maybe I would start with the present. I think there are key issues that we need to reflect. And I could hear James talking about the world, and I was imagining that he was talking the world we live. Allow me to start from there and share with you some of the key characteristics that for me defined where we are and some of the challenges and also the opportunities that we have in front of us. And I think the first characteristic is globalization, and the fact that I'm here and you are there and we are talking through Skype and through technology means that we can influence. We can influence local decisions, can have global impacts, and definitely global decisions do have local impacts. We are also living in a world that is uncertain, and that for us, it's probably, if we look to the past and where we are and how the past prepares us to deal with this, we are more educated to deal with certainty. So when you start living in a world where unexpected and the probability of more extreme events is something that we have to face, when our models are not anymore useful to predict, we have a problem. So we are uncertain and we have a difficulty to deal with uncertainty. We also are living in the world that is under pressure, population is increasing, more needs, but maybe the biggest pressure, and I'm glad that the draft declaration captures that quite well, is that we indeed live in the poor world. With all the advances, with all the richness, with all the things that we can do today, most of the world is poor, and poverty, it's one of our biggest challenge. And of course, we live in the world where knowledge and technology are more and more important, and that is leading us to a very unequal world. And if today we can do this, it's because I'm in Paris and you are in the US. If we try to do this with some countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and elsewhere in the world, it may not have been possible. We could have quite a lot of breaks before I could even go in the first minute of my intervention. So inequality is also something that is very much at the core of our world today. And I have to say that in the draft declaration, I don't feel that this issue is strongly there. So I'm really hoping that through the days of discussion, we can find space for also addressing the issue of inequalities. We also live in the polar world, where you could say that you have short-term government agenda, but you need long-term policies. Again, certainty versus uncertainty, disciplines. We love our disciplines, what we know, where we feel comfortable, but we need more inter and transdisciplinary science. We have connections that are known and we can use them to influence the policy-making processes, but there are also hidden connections, and a lot of times the science don't understand that or don't know those hidden connections, and the hidden connection can completely change the kind of decision you will have at the end. You have economical interests, but at the same time, you have social and environmental sustainability, the imperative of sustainability. You have political objectives and languages, but at the same time, you have science objectives and you have the science language. We have individual and coalition power, but at the other side, we have citizen solutions. So it's a polar world. And because of these characteristics of the world we live today, I think there are two key words that I think should come to the discussion. The first one is really urgency. I really don't think that we have time. The continuing functioning of the Earth system is at risk. So we need to act. And that's the second word, opportunity. We need to act, and I would say that today we know enough to act. New ideas can form and can spread quickly, and we need to act on that. And the science and the scientific understanding in the past decade is really trying to frame and is already giving us directions where this action has to go through. The first scientific understanding, and I think is a very powerful one, is the realization that we are indeed in the new era. We are on the Anthropocene, and the man has the responsibility for the changes that are occurring in the planet. And also the concept of thresholds, of planetary boundaries. The profoundly interconnected and interdependent Earth system. And I think this is something that is quite well developed in the draft declaration and all the concept of the Nexus conference. And I think this is really a very powerful concept, because it's really giving us new perceptions of responsibilities, new ways of acting, and really bringing this idea of planetary stewardship. And I think this is something that we need again to strengthen quite strongly in the declaration of this conference. And of course, if we have interconnected issues, we also need interconnected solutions. And I think that the challenge for all the scientific community is that it's not only about the rapid scientific and technological progresses. Of course, there is a lot that can be done. But I think that the requirement of social transformation needs to go hand in hand with what science and technology can bring. I also think that we need more than ever new approaches to research and to the interface between science, the decision makers in policy, in government, in business, in society. Clearly, science has changed quite a lot, and the trends that we are seeing, they are quite positive trends. I would say that once again, science is doing its role. In a way, is anticipating the needs of society and be prepared to address those needs. And I think that the first characteristic of today's science is the international nature, the collaborative nature of the science programs. And I think this is fundamental, because if we are talking about global sustainability, you need to have the scientific community everywhere, producing knowledge, new solutions, conferring, monitoring, assessing, dialoguing with policymakers, with decision makers, and really between themselves too. And this aspect of the internationalization of science and the more collaborative aspects of science is for me one of a very important trend in today's landscape. The second one, it's also the fact that it's becoming more and more integrative, more multidisciplinary, and really already moving towards a more transdisciplinary approach to science. And I think, again, this characteristic is fundamental if we want indeed to do the kind of science that we need to face the development issues that we have. But what we have to realize in these new trends is that although these very positive trends are happening, and technology has helped a lot, this capacity of the networking, the bringing all together and so on, there are some constraints. The first one is funding, and I would like to draw to the discussion the need to somehow in the declaration also to capture the need for new funding mechanisms that indeed promote these trends of more international science programs and more transdisciplinary science programs. The second issue that is also of paramount importance in my view is the capacity to participate in these programs. And this is, I'm addressing really the divides that we still see quite strongly in the world when it comes to knowledge production. And somehow we need to capture, and should be somehow also related to the sustainable development goals, the importance of creating a critical mass, the scientific ability to really participate in this quest for sustainable solutions for the future and for the challenges we are facing. And so clearly we need to start addressing some of these issues. The other thing that I would like to bring to the discussion, and it's not mine, I will quote late Professor Elinor Ostrom, when she called attention and said, given the mounting evidence of the sheer scale of global changes that we are witnessing, the scientific community has a responsibility to urge public officials, citizens and private firms in all countries to focus on the need for major policy changes to avoid irreparable damage to our planet. I think this call also to the scientific community to commit themselves and to urge everybody that things are changing and we need also to change in order to really make sure that we will have a sustainable path in the future. And I think when Lynn made this very strong statement during the Planet Under Pressure conference, she was also raising an issue that I always joke, saying that the S is for science indeed, but S is also for society. And this engagement of science with society, I think, has to be something that somehow we need to promote and to discuss. How can we measure that? How can we make sure that we are doing the right thing? Because if we have science, then we have the social transformation, society, then we have the social transformation. The power of transforming that is inherent to the discoveries of science will be then realized in society by promoting a more sustainable behavior. So basically, in my view, we do need to develop a more interactive dialogue on global sustainability and really moving towards co-design and co-production of knowledge. And we have a good example, the Future Earth, but we need more. We need more than Future Earth. Many more other programs like Future Earth with the same vision in order to really make the difference and really to have this commitment that we need to pursue a more sustainable path. I also believe that, as I mentioned before, we need a more integrative, more international, and more solution-oriented kind of science, really bringing collaboration within regions and between regions, and creating the human capacity that we'll need to have true collaboration. We need policies, science policies that are cross-cutting, that are building blocks for other public policies where scientific evidence not only inform decision-making processes, but even transform the way decisions are taken. So it's one step further than not just this idea that because I know what's happening, I can inform you, but it's because I know what is going to happen, I can transform the way you take decisions and making those decisions much more inclusive and much more part of a common vision of sustainability. And also the need to transform institutions. Again, I'm not sure that if this is part of this declaration, but some of the very, I would say, very ambitious goals of the declaration will need different institutional setups. And I think the Nexus conference is a wonderful opportunity to really listen to best practices and to really think creatively and to push forward some models of institutional setups where international networks can share human resources, infrastructure, big data, and doing that always with a common vision that is global sustainability. And I think I'm at the end of my 8 minutes. And what I would like to really finalize this is that we really need to make sure that we can safeguard our Earth's natural processes, and that means that global sustainability must become a foundation of society, an imperative of whatever we do, and therefore somehow we have to bring this to the Sustainable Development Goals, and that more than ever, I believe that research has a key role to play, but we need to remodeling, we need to engage better with policy, with business, with society, and we need to work together, and we have to commit ourselves to really walk this path together. I think the time to act is more than ever is today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lidia. If you can hear me, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, connected by Nexus, I'm very pleased to be on this panel. I've basically come from small town Bonn on River Rhine in Germany to thank Felix Dodd and Jamie Bartram that they continue to carry the banner on Nexus forward and plant it for a little while here in North Carolina. It needs to be carried forward, and my plea up front is at the end of this conference, Felix, I hope you have identified someone who does Nexus 2017. Because we need a sense of urgency, but we also need, I think, like Franz Kafka, a sense of patience. You know, Franz Kafka has declared the biggest sin of humankind is impatience. You have to be persistent. This Nexus thing will not be bought in 2 years, in 3 years, in 6 years by all those who have to buy in. But I think it's so obvious that it makes sense that it will get complete buy-in. The Nexus approach put forward at the Bonn Nexus conference in 2011 focused on water, food security, energy security. Towards the end of the conference, in a statement at the conference, it was emphasized that people have to be at the center of Nexus. Nothing else, people. I think that's also absolutely central in order to get the buy-in in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, the people focus. I will make a few remarks on those two things which have the arrows up on the right corner, on governance and on innovation, and connect to the science agenda briefly in this talk. Before I do that, let me repeat, not read, the principles and the how-to points from the Bonn conference. The three principles put forward there after the conference in the concluding statements, putting people at the center of the Nexus. That means people's behavior, people-oriented services and investments. Secondly, working towards legislative frameworks and good governance, reducing corruption and involving local communities. Very important principles. The Nexus opportunities were highlighted at the conference require certain actions, including mobilizing consumers. Nexus is not just about resource economics and resource policies. It's about getting the consumers also involved. I have, with great interest, read and sometime commented also on the emerging Nexus declaration. If you haven't read it so far, dear audience, get engaged. It's worth your while. Maybe after the reception tonight, read it again and comment. You will be proud to be part of this. So it's a great declaration. It can have a major impact. But I have 4 bullet points which need more emphasis, in my opinion, humble opinion. More on science and technology, and Lidia has already spoken in that direction. I think it could be more specific on health and sanitation. I think it needs to connect to growth, to sustainable growth, to green growth, to good growth, and to industrialization. And it has to have a strong emphasis on sound governance and management of the Nexus itself, not just general good governance. Nexus research, and that's, Jamie, I understand our agenda in this panel, I think needs to be carried forward, especially in these 3 areas. I mean, it's such a huge set of domains where Nexus research would be helpful. 1, on the trans-sectoral action for sustainable development investments. 2, on governance, especially on decentralization and scale. And 3, on innovation. Let me briefly flag these issues with one example each and leave it at that. The key issue number 1, the trans-sectoral actions, I exemplify with what we call, and what the world now calls, bioeconomy. The interlinked value chains building and transforming an economy on bio-based materials, both from the agriculture, raw material side, and from the modern chemical sectors. And the basic philosophy and idea behind bioeconomy is to produce products which have no footprint, products which actually may have negative footprints, which means they don't step on the earth, they fly. Yeah, dream of the compostable car, or the recapturing of carbon from the atmosphere and producing carbon fibers and build buildings out of new materials. The list of products which exist already is very long, not just these spleeny ideas which I've just mentioned. So bioeconomy is, I think, at the core of Nexus production and innovation, Nexus products. Example number 2, the Nexus governance challenges. Governance is currently done too much in isolation. We have all said so. My point is that we have to focus on the Nexus at the local level in particular. What I show you here is a world map of marginality, overlaying poverty with ecological issues, with governance quality. Out of it comes a very complex picture. The world which wants to achieve sustainable development needs to identify its actions at a very decentralized and diverse level. So, mostly local is this water, food, energy nexus. That has big implications for the SDGs. The emphasis needs to be on local governance in the nexus context. We have a very fortunate trend currently going on. In the last 20 years, 80% of the developing countries of the world have introduced decentralization reforms with stronger local government. So, but what is Nexus governance? First best might be, some people would think so, establish a Nexus governing body. I don't think that's a good idea. It may be theoretically the best. I think the second best is better. Establish intergovernmental consultative mechanisms for Nexus governance. And many of those exist already. So not bigger, better silos. My third issue is Nexus innovation needs to come about across sectors, scales, and regions. And here I want to highlight 3 examples. Comprehensive footprint analysis. I'm delighted that this is a topic here at the conference. I think the gross water footprint analysis doesn't carry much weight. Secondly, comprehensive food security climate change research, not just supply focused, as a recent analysis which we have done, published in Science, has shown. And third, information and behavioral change support in the complex adverse Nexus environments. For instance, all the water sanitation issues around the mega cities where they are ungoverned. These are the domains where science has to make the major difference. So the way forward is the opportunities to embed the Nexus agenda into the implementation of the SDG agenda. And that requires the usual stakeholder voice, best fit rather than best practices for governance mechanisms, and so on. But let me leave you with these 2 thoughts. There are also doubts. And we probably would be a lot more in the Nexus community if there wouldn't be doubts. Let's face it, and let's fight it. Because the sectoral forces are very strong. And they will fight for their special interest domains if they feel them threatened. Let's be smart political economists with the Nexus. The facet in my conclusion is we must overcome these hurdles on the way towards with Nexus agenda and the sustainable development goals. We have to tell time and again, will not function without a Nexus approach guiding their implementation. Thank you for your attention. I now pass on to Johan, and please, Johan, walk up here. Without further ado, rush it. And thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot. What an introduction. We have had two excellent speakers. What can I add? Well, maybe nothing. So it could be a very short speech, but then I wouldn't fulfill my role. I can always start with, again, also thanking Jamie and Felix for really organizing this session. What I think is great, and this doesn't happen very often, to tell you the truth, is the fact that we have a session focusing on science, in this case. And I think that is actually extraordinary. We quite often skip that. We go to the policy directly, and we say, we know what we need to do, and just do it. We don't need science any longer, do we? Well, coming from a science-based organization doesn't make me too happy. So I'm very pleased that you've done this. I will not comment so much on the declaration or anything, but I would give some personal perspectives, rather, on some of the challenges that I see that we have as a scientific community. One fundamental question is, if we have all this knowledge that we claim we do, and we really point out in many areas that we do, climate change, or that we need energy transitions, or we need to completely change our urban settings and so on, why is not more happening? What's the problem, really? What is it that prevents policymakers to take the necessary steps that we are pointing out for them? I think this puts a lot of challenges on us scientists to also look into ourselves and how we do our business, how we actually perform our job. We can see that much more we need to be directly policy relevant in the work we do. This can be challenging for a scientist. It gives, you have to give up some of your scientific credibility to a certain degree. You're sometimes pushed into almost advocacy. That's tough. It's tricky. We have to be much more solution-oriented. We have to respond to the challenges of policymakers, which is not just about the Nexus. It's about job creation. It's about economic development. There are so many other aspects that must be integrated into this. And if we want to succeed as scientists, we need to address them. Then people will listen. And it's also about the different scales which are completely shifting, going from local to global, and the pace of things. The scientific process is slow, should be slow, but must also have ways of communicating on the way. So the future was also part of this session. Building a new future. The focus on the word building there, I think, is great. And of course, it's difficult to predict, especially the future. We know certain things about major trends and so on, how we can deal with them fairly well. Population growth, urbanization, etc. These are major trends we know. But there are also major uncertainties, and the scientific community must be able to respond how we can build adaptive societies to these uncertainties. And then to deal with surprises. Many of the major shifts in society is actually based on surprises to many. When the economic crisis came in 2007, a lot of consultants looking at economies were surprised. They didn't expect Goldman Sachs to crash. When the Berlin Wall fell, a lot of people were surprised. We could see it coming maybe, but these major political economic shifts actually come as a surprise. And the question is, of course, what's the role of the scientific community to deal with such surprises and actually be better at maybe predicting them? So the economists, they're excellent at trying to, at least after something has happened, ask a very good question. And I must say, it was very interesting because this is actually a success case, and we can't take the tribute for it because we are not mentioned as organizations, but we were a number of organizations in 2011 who organized what we call a Nobel Laureate Symposium to discuss the Anthropocene, the major changes, the fact that humans are the drivers of change of this planet. And what we did then was to compromise a bit. We invited a couple of journalists to actually be embedded in the process and have the free access to everything and write what they want to write, but without necessarily having to attribute it to people and so on. And this became a special feature in a journal which is, of course, very, very influential on policy making. So again, it's also about finding smart ways of doing things. We were, of course, really happy that we were also invited by the German government to take part in writing some of the baseline documents for the 2011 conference. And it was interesting not just because it was really difficult to understand the Nexus, I can tell you, but it also challenged the way we were organizing our own work in my own organization, Stockholm Environment Institute. We have scientists spanning from economy, social sciences, to natural sciences. Having to write this and understanding suddenly these issues of interacting between sectors also challenged our way of working internally. And we understood that although we say we work in integrated fashion, we are far from doing it. And there are many barriers, language barriers, etc., academic barriers. We also have different approaches, of course, to try to explain a very complicated world. For many years, scientists at Stockholm Environment Institute, Stockholm Resilience Center, has worked to develop the planetary boundary concepts. From a pedagogical point of view, this has been excellent. Every businessman that you talk to, every policymaker said, yeah, now I understand. I see these major systems, and I understand they are critical for us. However, to translate this into management is very difficult. The question you get is, excellent, what do I do now? As a result of the Bonn conference, and Joachim, you had changed a little bit there, and I like the changes, to be honest. We came up with, the German government came up with this fantastic graph, giving things a very orderly way of presenting, and how things are connected. Scientists also like this. This is what we try to do. We bring chaos into some kind of order, and then we try to explain it. The private sector, on the other hand, they also want a lot of order. So if you look at their think tanks, you would expect even more easier graphs. And I just have a favorite graph to show the real nexus. And that comes from the World Economic Forum. We can laugh about this, and we should, because it's, of course, a terrible graph. But I think it's actually very good, because this is the reality that is facing most policymakers. When they make decisions, this is what they need to make the decisions on. Whether they know it or not, that's another question. But this is what influences them, how things are interconnected. So when we talk about the nexus, as you say, we should not limit ourselves too much. And I'm a little bit worried, and that's one of the few criticisms then about the declaration, when we talk about the Nexus community. I don't think that it exists. I think we should be careful about calling it even Nexus community. I think that closes the door for many other actors that we need to engage with. You can then, of course, look at many different dimensions. And I only have this graph because it, again, shows a nexus perspective, but then, again, trying to look at different sectors, different aspects, resilience, sustainability, and equity, for instance, and then different scales. What is interesting that this is something we developed in SCI in the 1990s, when we exactly came to the same conclusion that we are doing today. Everything is interlinked, and we need to deal with it somehow. I need to end also with another picture that I really love. And I want to stress one thing. One aspect when you deal with the political system is that certain issues are no-nos. And I forcefully tried to, for instance, and I've done so in some conferences, provoked by trying to say that we must address these no-nos as well. And one aspect when it comes to the issues we are talking about here is international trade. Global trade on food products, foreign direct investments. They are go-go's from a political perspective because trade negotiations, and everybody knows that, is very, very sensitive. Even the World Trade Organization recognizes that water is key, but they talk about virtual water, but they also say then that when we deal with natural resources, food is not counted because agriculture is too sensitive. So this is really the picture that I think we need to look at the same time. It's developed by a bank. Again, very interesting because it's another sector who is then the driver to try to analyze what is happening in this particular area. But this is really the nexus playing out, and you can really get so much information from this map. You can see how sensitive, for instance, the global food system is. 6 countries providing more or less all the food that enters into the global food market, for instance. The same countries, if you look at the projections from the IPCC, that are really threatened by climate change. So there are many of these kind of aspects that we can draw from illustrations such as this one, and we have to open up the whole Nexus debate, the whole Nexus decisions or discussions to a host of actors that have tremendous amounts of knowledge to understand the complexities of this planet. And the financial sector is actually one of them. To try to get these on board, I would argue, is also key. And of course, then you can make everything very complicated and add all these various dimensions that make things more politically interesting and scientifically challenging, of course. I can say even in my own organization, I have people that are strongly working on and proposing that bioenergy is really a solution. And I have scientists who are actually strongly working towards proving that this is a really bad solution. That's the way it should be. So, for 25 years, we have been trying to work on this, bridging science and policy. And I can only say, when we were established in 1989, it was at the process leading up to Rio, when this really started to become a key issue, trying to bridge science and policy, addressing interlinkages and complexities. And I'm so excited, because the world is getting even more complex and interlinked and challenging. So for an organization like SEI and for conferences such as this one, we're going to have a lot of work to do, even in the next 10 to 15 years. On one side, maybe that's a bit depressing, because it means that we haven't solved many of the fundamental problems. But of course, from a scientist's point of view, that is wonderful. So thank you very much.
Okay. Well, I think I am batting last here. Let's see if I can. And now if I hit this next slide, let's see what happens. All right. So I'm just going to start off and try and keep us to time here, where by saying that most people know WWF as an organization that works on places and species, and yet it's also an organization that, like many other big NGOs, is grappling more and more with what it considers the drivers of change. And when any big organization tries to walk into areas it hasn't done a lot of work in before, it creates lots of issues in terms of how it gets its information, its information chains and such. And WWF is no different. And as we move our programs upstream into these spaces, we find ourselves encountering lots of questions we weren't encountering before, and we have to figure out how to answer those questions. And sort of the traditional way you do that, of course, is to sort of go out to the academic literature. But this is actually much harder than it seems these days. It's harder because what I call this information haystack. In the time that I'll be speaking, there's going to be 25 or 30 peer-reviewed papers published. They're going to be published in any number of the 26,000 peer-reviewed journals that are out there today. And that rate of information flow will double in 18 to 24 months. And even if we think of the journals that are focused on organizations like ours, much of the information in there is just not fit for purpose. It doesn't actually solve the problems at the scales and with the integration that's necessary for large NGOs or other actors in this space, policy brokers, to get the work done that they need to get done. So we're in this space where we're trying to stitch together a conservation program based on knowledge needles that we're looking for in this massive and growing haystack of information. And this creates lots of problems. And so we're probably not going to solve it this way. We're not just simply going to hire more guys to go look through the haystack, or more women. And that's not going to be an efficient way to solve this problem. We have to think much more effectively about and intelligently about how we work with knowledge creators around the world, so that we're not simply searching for knowledge needles, but we're actually trying to make them bigger, collaboratively, working together. And that, I think, is what the Luke Hoffman Institute was really created for. And It's an institute that just opens its doors about, in last year and last fall. And what we're there to do is to look inward to WWF and figure out where the big information and research needs are in an organization, needs that would change the way we do our work, change the way conservation is done, and needs that have really strong policy and practice implications. We can use the results of that research. When we find that, we pivot outwards, we go out to the knowledge communities around the world, and we try and collaborate to figure out solutions, bring people together to work collaboratively on creating those bigger knowledge needles for organizations like our own. So that's why we're here in a lot of ways, is because if there are 4 words that really define sustainability in the 21st century, they're up there. They're food, energy, water, and climate. And so the first big project that we initiated at the Luke Hoffman Institute was focused in this space, was focused explicitly on food, energy, water, and we call it the LIVES project. It's the Living Indicators for Vital Ecosystem Services, Linked Indicators for Vital Ecosystem Services, excuse me. And the vital in there really is food, energy, and water. And it's a new project, and we're not interested in sort of and becoming. We're interested to be here to learn, to listen, to collaborate, because there's a lot of voices trying to take this indicator or that system or that tool and say it needs priority. That's the way we should do it, and that's not the way we really work at the Luke Hoffman Institute. We're very interested in bringing people together, getting voices together to figure out what we can do collaboratively, and also we have our particular lens, like a lot of people in the room do, and our lens, of course, is that. Another sort of key end product is the preservation of biodiversity along with this. So when we think about food, energy, water, and climate, we think of it where, in the regions that have a really high biodiversity value and how to include that end product in the process explicitly. And we're very interested in doing this in a decision support context with decision makers. And that leads to, I think, sort of a key thing for me, which is that much of the decisions that are made about our national resources are made at national levels. They're sovereign actors. And if we talk about, and the metrics we currently use to say whether that was a successful or a less successful decision are relatively simplistic. They're typically jobs and GDP. And from that logic, we then understand that some of the discussion around the Nexus thinking has to include a discussion of how we think about our systems of national accounts, for example, how we think about the greening of GDP and the debates around that, how we influence that debate productively so that we take better account of the stocks and flows of natural resources and integrate them into the way we measure the world and how we measure success. And really we're talking about creating a bit of a new development paradigm or a development narrative. And the current narrative, of course, is an empirical one. One nation looks to the other and says, how did you get where you are? And so we can look at the U.S. and say, how do you get a nation that has a relatively developed economy and relatively clean rivers at the same time? And you can tick off a number of other nations that may have gotten there too. And the path, of course, is relatively simple. It's to maximize GDP, to develop your economic engine and clobber the natural assets in the process, and then clean up the parts you live in afterwards when you've developed the resources to do that. That's the standard development paradigm that we work in. And of course, part of our challenge is to sort of produce the evidence that shows just because that worked in the past doesn't mean that's going to work in the future. In fact, trying it that way now is much, much too expensive. So that's sort of the difference between looking at the environmental movement in this country, which started 40 years ago, and that's the difference between the Cuyahoga River in the 50s and what it is today, and the sort of same pivot that China's making right now. And it's going to try and do at the same time, and recognizing that estimates of the economic damage caused by environmental problems in China are roughly estimated somewhere at about 9% of GDP. It's a huge burden, and countries that are further down the development ladder are even will have even a harder time of using this standard approach. With India, for example, losing 6% of GDP for just 2 environmental issues: sanitation and poor water. So these issues they're sobering, but they're also powerful tools. I think much of the way we've shown that they're powerful is actually at much more local levels. This, for example, sorry about that. This, for example, is Lake Naivasha in Kenya, and WWF and a bunch of others really focused on the economic impact of this ecosystem and showed that because of the cut flower market, this one ecosystem and the water that flows out of it is responsible for for a huge amount of foreign exchange in Kenya. And by showing that and illustrating it, we got rapid policy change. And it was that sort of showing it at scale and focusing on solutions that allowed policy change to take place. So let's see. This, of course, I mean, in some ways, I think that the issue is exactly this at slightly larger scales, and that we know how to place a value on natural capital, and the economics of that have been in place in the abstract for some time. The challenge, of course, is in the development of indicators and tools that allow decision makers to connect impacts at the scales and in the context they're working. And this is the hard part that we've been also often wrestling with, particularly at national levels. This is where we move from knowledge creation to knowledge co-creation, working together, and where we start with the needs of stakeholders and back up to the science. So the science comes that direction. And this is where I think the academic and practitioners network is so important in creating that science to policy interface that continues to inform both the scientific community on what questions and in what contexts do we really need tool development, and then works the other way as well so that the policy community is taking advantage of the advances that are being made. It's a non-trivial process, and it's been undervalued in both communities, I think. If there's three different sort of bits that I think this group, this academic and practitioners network, need to work on are their standardization, scaling, and integration. And in standardization, I think if we want to take this work to scale and not just do it in small scales, we need to recognize and work with the enduring structures we have right now to measure success in the world. So we need to build our Nexus thinking into the way in which decisions are made right now, recognizing that the vocabulary that's currently used by decision makers is the vocabulary we will have to be measured against, not our own vocabulary. And then in scaling, I think it's safe to say that in the science side, we've made major strides at the two scales that have the least probability of impacting policy. And this is at the global scale and at the local scale. And there's not near as much in the center there. I think of this a little bit like a sandwich that just doesn't have enough fixings in the center. You've got great examples that Johan talked about, for example, of new vocabularies for how to really think about Nexus thinking from the global scale, from planetary boundaries, from donut economics, and the list is quite strong, and it builds this scaffolding down. And then we have a lot of examples coming up from the bottom at project level, examples of Nexus thinking and river and watershed management, and how that's been really working for us. Super important as well. But we have fewer examples of how we've embedded Nexus thinking in the decision processes at the national level. And that's the part I think that we have a lot of work to do there. That's why you make a sandwich, is for what's in the center. And we don't want just to eat the bread sandwich. We want to have more in that national level where we can have really strong impact where the decisions are made. So I think Johan's right. There's a lot of work to do. That's great from a scientific standpoint. And there's also a lot of urgency. It needs to get done sooner than most scientists like to work. I'll just finish by saying that we all, I think, are here because we think of science as a tool, not just as an abstract account. And the impact will only be as great as our capacity to provide a tool that fits the problems at hand. Those problems are often national, they're sometimes regional, and if we're going to be able to provide solutions, we have to be working together across this science to policy divide. Scaling, standardization, integration from indicators and accounting through to scenario modeling. These are, I think, some of the biggest challenges for the academic and practitioners network. And I'll stop there.
So thank you to our four speakers. We've got just a few moments left for some questions. So what I'd like to do is point out that we have microphones on each side of the room. And I'm hoping that someone's going to start to move towards them, because there's nothing worse than that deadly silence. But as people do so, could I ask that each person briefly says who they are? And can we keep the questions tight and focused? We don't have long, and I'd like to make sure that a reasonable number of people get the opportunity to speak.
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Ed Barry with the Sustainable World Initiative. And we participated in the Planet Under Pressure conference, which came out with a very strong statement about how we are not pursuing a sustainable development path, human development path. And it got virtually ignored by the Rio process. So my question is, and I sense that this may happen again in the SDG process, because that's going to be subject to a year-long political negotiation once the Open Working Group has completed its efforts. So I guess my question is, what would be your suggestions for how we might avoid the same ignoring of the scientific aspects and planetary boundaries, those sorts of things? Thank you.
Johan, you've been in the middle of this system for so long, and I feel comfortably out of it these days. Is that one for you?
Well, I mean, the thing is, you are even more an expert on that, and Felix has dedicated his whole life to try to understand how you influence these intergovernmental processes. But from my narrow perspective, I recognize it. I agree with this. It's always a frustration, and it's not just a frustration from Planet Under Pressure. It's a frustration from every single conference that is not officially recognized as an official input to these intergovernmental processes. I think it's just a fact. But I think sometimes we underestimate the impacts it has anyway. That's number one. So I think still, even though we don't maybe see it directly, I mean, the reason that the Rio outcomes didn't really became that kind of Shakespearean output that we were hoping for was not just because Planet Under Pressure. I don't think you could do very much more to influence that. So there are many, many other aspects behind it, I think. But just finally, I think we must always try to work through other channels. It's very difficult to take a scientific conference and then send it directly to the UN. What we have to do is a commitment from scientists at the national level to work through our respective governments. That's how we influence these intergovernmental processes.
I don't see anyone else gagging to respond to that. I thought Josh was going to use it as another example of having to work within the rules rather than make our own rules, but maybe not.
I'll let that go.
You'll let that one go. Kind man. Let's take one more from the floor.
Good evening, and thank you to the panel. My name is Eckhard Kleiner. I'm working for GRM Futures Group. I see integration on the last slide, and integration is not really a new concept. We have been talking about in the 60s integrated rural development. In the 80s, we talked about integrated conservation and development projects. What is new about integration? How do we define integration? How do we make a difference in integrating our approaches to climate change and all the other development subjects? Thank you.
So I'll give it a shot. I mean, one of the things that I think is sort of interesting about, you mentioned integration and climate change, and is this issue that, if you look at the global budget for integrated modeling, for example, or modeling and scenario modeling in general, we've been, spending 90% of that on one type of scenario, right? We've been modeling emission scenarios, and that's where most of our money has gone over the last decade and longer. It's a hugely important task, but it has left us a bit flat-footed and a bit behind the 8 ball on being able to do the kind of integrated modeling we need to do in this room, where we're bringing in a whole bunch of other issues, and we don't have the tool set that can be brought out of the box and applied in the context where it needs to be applied rapidly enough to influence the decisions in a lot of cases. And so getting up to speed on that, I think, is something that is non-trivial and has only been addressed by a small number of groups. There are some really interesting groups like the Iconics groups and others that are starting to push the climate space into truly integrated fashion. There are others that are thinking about it in other areas. But there's a ton more to be done there. And so I think there's a ton to do. But I agree with you that the idea of integration has been around a long time. Our ability to do it fast enough and to have the evidence chain strong enough to convince decision makers with it, I think, is still largely lacking. I mean, what you're looking for is, I think, some of the maps that we saw before, where you do integrate and show a relatively simple heat map of risk that integrates across food, energy, water, and climate at a scale that it actually matches the decision makers' need. I mean, that's a tall order right now. I think we have a lot of work to do there.
My name is Malcolm Potts. I was on the Royal Society Population, the Planet, and I think you're making a very big mistake, and I want to ask you when you're going to correct it. Your driving the global agenda diagram takes population as a given. Population is not a given. Population is a variable open to change in a human rights framework. You wanted surprises. Let me give you two. Tens of millions of people in Bangladesh now have 2 children. The most rapid population decline in the world, the most rapid decline in not the population, but in the total fertility rate, is in the Islamic Republic of Iran. So please put population on the agenda as a variable open to change. And when you do that, everything changes. If you don't do that, you are whistling in the wind.
I see panelists keen to respond.
Okay.
Joachim, you're first.
Well, thank you for driving your point. You gave a wonderful lecture this afternoon, which I enjoyed listening. You see, when emphasizing that people are at the center of the Nexus agenda, and I believe I said people's behavior and people-related policies, people's behavior, of course, fundamentally includes fertility behavior and a few other behavioral aspects. So your point is well taken, but in a brief moment here we couldn't talk about it. I think we need to, or we have maybe not spent enough time on it in general. I take that point. The case of Bangladesh, I think, is a very important one, which you mentioned. I've been part of the creation of the Food for Education program in Bangladesh in the early 1990s, which led to an increase of 30% of girls' primary school enrollment. And this and the investment in rural electrification were the 2 key elements which facilitated the fertility decline in Bangladesh. So girls' education and infrastructure. I think the environmental community, if I may placate some community out there like that, is not taking enough attention to education and infrastructure.
And just also to add, I think, you're absolutely right, and it's. I think that if you look at many of the trends that we are actually looking at, that the UN is also presenting, they are actually counting exactly what you are saying on a quite dramatic decrease in fertility rates in the world. So I think, from that perspective, we have to adapt to these trends in a way when we are looking at the future. We have similar problems in other areas, a big discussion back and forth whether, for instance, related to peak oil and so on, when that is coming. If you look at many of the IPCC projections, they're basically saying that we will continue to burn carbon and it will increase for the next maybe 100 years. You can also challenge some of these trends. Another thing, if we come to population, and I think that is something to consider for the declaration actually, is the old division of developing and developed countries, which is also something you could really challenge to a big degree, I think. We're talking about heavy consumption in developed countries, I think is something that is mentioned in the declaration. But we have a middle class in India, in China, and in many what we call developing countries still, which are at the same level of consumption as we are in Europe or in North America. And this is old thinking still that prevails in a lot of what we do. So I think that your point is really well taken, and we have to always challenge our old thinking and what is stuck in our systems when we look at science moving forward.
And I think if I'm going to be allowed Chair's privilege, it's refreshing to see the population issue on the table. Some work we've been doing here highlights the interactions between population, but also household size, and the two together and their impact on resource demands and environment. So thank you for bringing that up, particularly in such an engaging way. I'm going to allow one more question, because otherwise I'm between you and reception, and that's a really dangerous place to be.
Yeah, my name is Muhammad Yassin. I am from University of Udine in Italy and currently visiting scholar in University of Minnesota. My question is focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals, which, if I go back, it was Millennium Development Goals when it was its time. And when we read it, we were thinking that it was something just concerning the poor countries because of its focus on poverty, and education and health. And then the last objective, the last goal was the global partnership, and sustainability was there. And now it seems that sustainability is taking a major priority in the global agenda. But still, that developing countries, poor countries, are still behind because some countries even not heard about the Millennium Development Goals, and now the world is setting new agenda for the sustainable development goals. So don't you think that we are just repeating the same scenario of the past, that by excluding certain realities? And also in terms of diagnosis, that was diagnosis of the problems and challenges, and as you have mentioned, solution-oriented. But this solution orientation doesn't explain to us how to implement. So if you can explain on the pathways of implementation or finding this solution. Thank you.
Yeah, just on the last question, since I mentioned the whole solution-oriented approach, and then I leave the easy question about the MDGs and SDGs to my... You should always take the chance when you have it. Well, you're absolutely right, and there is actually a process around having a more solution-oriented approach in the way you're operating and working. And one of the first things there is to, from the beginning, focus very much on the how. So that is the whole idea about taking this approach. I'm not saying it's easy. It's almost like a management consultant term. But it changes the mind shift on when you identify and when you define your project or your science question, and the how issue becomes really up front from the start. And I think going back and a little bit to the first question about why the planet under pressure did not maybe succeed, it goes back a little bit to this, because in order to do so, you must involve those that have the problem from the start. And I think that the Science Under Pressure conference wasn't solution-oriented in that sense, because it ended up with yet another statement about the enormous challenges that humanity is facing. So when you do that, the policymakers will say, okay, yes, we know, but what do we do about it? If you from the beginning instead had a solution-oriented approach, it would mean that you would try to address these enormous sustainability challenges within the context of the policymakers' world, meaning that you would at the same time try to link it to employment, economic development, etc., etc. So I think that's one way of combining these two questions also.
I'll just follow up on that, which I think is that that is actually quite a radical shift for most in academia. Like that, thinking that way is not the way that most of our academic organizations are set up at all. And it does require us to rethink how we go from what we mean by a solution-oriented science community. We don't have that, and we don't have the incentive structures built into academics to provide that currently. And so, that requires pressure at a lot of different fronts, because there are a few institutes out there that try to do this, that do the science to policy work, that really work at this, working from the problems and backing up to the science that are needed. But the only way it's going to get done is a sort of a sea change in this space. Not just a few institutes saying, but there's also really good applied science out there. It has to be much more the norm, and that requires big changes by institutions. I mean, when you think, I think a lot of academics would broach at the idea that they are in the service industry. But, the word service is actually a pretty noble cause. And to think about that's your job as an academic and the opportunity to create change through that work, I think that bit of the culture has been left aside to some extent. And the sort of nobility, the importance of being in a service industry has been lost from a lot of how we think of ourselves as academics. Bringing that back in and recognizing that as you're training new, rising stars in those fields, I think is going to be an important part of how we see the role of science changing policy, Because until they see that as their goal, that's not going to be a big part of their output.
I add a sentence on your first question. I think if sustainable development goals are misunderstood as being played against poverty reduction goals, they would be doomed. There's no chance to get in this world, as multipolar and as divided as it is, an SDG agenda which will not put poverty reduction first, with all what it means in relation to jobs, to human security, and a heavy dose of a livable human rights agenda for the poor. I think this goes without saying. That's why I think the Nexus agenda statement also should emphasize that very much. I think this agenda also has to embrace positively inclusion of low-income countries and low-income people into trade. A sustainable world needs to trade more, of course, internalizing all external effects. But I think this pro-growth nexus agenda, pro-poor growth nexus agenda is not well understood. That's why I find often when I'm in fora in low-income countries and with people from developing countries that the SDG agenda is misunderstood as a northern environmentalist agenda rather than a pro-poor global agenda where everyone, be it rich consumers and rich producers and the poor, have to play their role.
Thank you. And could I ask everyone to join me in thanking once more our four speakers, Lidia, Joachim, Johan and Josh.